Fellow tacticians, for today's video, as promised, we're going to be doing the Njal character spotlight. We're going to talk about a quick nerf to the Winged Prime, and we're also going to be talking about some different passives and how they work on bosses. So, let's jump on into it. So let's start by ripping the band-aid off. For the Winged Prime, the developers decided to reduce the health of some of the summons to give everybody a better chance to kill them off before they start overwhelming your defenses completely. So let's read the exact quote here. We have reduced the HP of the 7 Hormagaunts of the Winged Prime to give more characters a chance to one-shot the Gaunts on the same level. For example, the Psychers currently don't have that chance, so if you look at the HP from the previous summons that we had in the last video, I think it was sitting around 4,000. Reducing this would really enable some of them to have a chance to kill them off. Currently don't have that chance among others. We're basing this change on an internal balance review and community feedback we've received with related content. Since the Winged Prime release event hasn't even started yet, we know this doesn't really affect you, but if you made plans based on our videos, make your tweaks now. So this goes to emphasize that everything is still subject to change, even, based just right before the hero release event. Technically it's in the game, but hey, there's still room for it to be modified for you. So anything that you see is always subject to change, and it's an online game. This can happen, 2 months into the character being released. Now, granted, it wouldn't feel as good, and it seems Snowprint really has an aversion to doing precisely that. That's why it was such a big deal when they nerfed Yarick, Aleph Null, and Archimatos. So, something to keep in mind, but nothing's ever set in stone in an online game. Balancing needs to happen, and, I really wouldn't be surprised, and this is not an allusion to anything, if we see either something happen to Eldreon or something to really shift the meta here in the near future. Now, granted, that is with no inside knowledge of anything happening. I'm just speculating. So, with that being said, let's go ahead and hop into showcasing some of Njal and some of those debuffs that we talked about. So I've assembled a team here for the Legendary 4 Screamer Killer to highlight quite a few different things. First off is going to be Ulf. Sitting in the position that he's currently in will also show the bug fix coming into the game here, showing that Living Battering Ram and the melee attack will both apply even when the target is kind of pinned up against a wall. Ulf will also demonstrate his passive ability every single round, because every single round the Screamer Killer uses an ability. Eldreon's here because it wouldn't be a guild raid without Eldreon. We have Mr. Njal here coming in. You can see his in-game model for the first time, unless you've seen it from somebody else. And we're going to highlight him for obvious reasons. We also have Tiark coming in. He's just here for the thematic purposes. And then we have Janezar coming in as well. Now, I want to talk about, in this video specifically, shown debuffs versus invisible debuffs, effective debuffs versus non-effective debuffs. It's all just a whole bunch of word vomit right here, but hopefully in this video I'll be able to clarify some things. So, for this first round, let's go ahead and keep everything in slow motion. We're not going to have anybody really do anything just yet, but I want to highlight the damage being applied by Screamer Killer onto Ulf when nobody else is around. So, he uses his ability because Screamer Killer uses his ability, pushes him into the wall, and then Ulf took a little bit of damage there from the melee attack. Now, something that I want to highlight here is take a close look at that damage that was being applied. Now, unfortunately, we're going to have to take a quick snap just to get things into the proper position. So, 1 second. Okay, everybody has been moved into their proper position. So we brought Janezar over here into melee range, and hopefully she won't get knocked back. And we still have Ulf in normal range as well. Now, this is Legendary 4, and you saw the amount of damage that Ulf took here from that melee attack. Jane's passive, for a reminder, is adjacent enemy units deal minus 800 damage at max rank, and have one of their hits in their melee reduced to a minimum of 1. Now, you'll notice that the boss isn't displaying a debuff here, and Janezar never actually displays a debuff with her ability. So, is it being applied or not? The answer is actually yes. Despite being immune, he is actually being affected by this debuff, despite it not being displayed as a debuff. One other character that works very similar to this is Tiark. However, Tiark always shows his debuff to the adversary that he's impacting because it's a range of 2. Now, obviously, you won't see it on Screamer Killer because he's not a Psyker, But even if he was a psyker, you wouldn't see it be shown because for some reason bosses don't display Tiark's debuff. But they are actually being impacted by his debuff. So it's one of those weird, it's working, but it's not showing you it's working unless you test it. And we actually had one of the developers confirm that both aspects of Tiark's debuff will apply to a boss. So that is interesting. Now let's take a look and put our money where our mouth is. So we'll just go ahead and attack, and we'll skip our turn here. So the passive applies, living battering ram hits, and then the subsequent melee hit, you can see the damage going out there, and you can see the splash and see the difference in numbers on different bosses. Now this is Legendary 4. Jane Czar's not very tanky inherently, and the Screamer Killer hits like a truck. Now let's go ahead and take a look at Mr. Njal here. And first let's go ahead and use that active ability just because it's fun. So we'll go ahead and use the active ability here and look at all of that ice getting thrown out onto the battlefield. Now, a little bit of a caveat here. We see, once again, a debuff being applied to the boss. But in this case, the debuff is showing, but it's not actually affecting the boss. The boss is immune to hex effects. So it's a really odd situation that we're in where we have debuffs that don't impact bosses being shown, debuffs that do impact bosses not being shown, and hopefully this is something that gets corrected in the future. So let's go ahead and skip our turn yet again, and everything has been moved. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at Njal in himself here. So he's sitting here and he's surrounded by 2 ice hexes, and he also doesn't have elevation bonus, right? And if we move him onto different parts of the map, here he's going to be surrounded by 3, and we'll actually have a little bit more damage amp. Now, if we bring Ulf in to apply his his active ability and get a little bit more ice on the battlefield, you can see that moving into different positions now, or this area where Njal is surrounded by 5 hexes, would actually do a lot more damage. If we move him up into this top corner, we'd get even more. And that melee attack looks so damn satisfying. It's 100% Pierce on Psychic Attack 3 times, I believe it is. So that is awesome to see. Now, Njal is affected by his own ice, which does suck. He will take additional crit damage, but with a 5% crit chance from the Screamer Killer. Wait, you know, that's hopefully won't crit, and hopefully won't have ourselves a bad time. Now, ultimately, since bosses are unaffected by ice, I talked about this in a previous video, I kind of want to highlight where I think Njal will fall on our Imperial tier list. And without bringing that tier list up, I feel like he falls into the average category. We really need to see where we're getting a little bit more impact in Tournament Arena and see how things work out in that regard. And I genuinely still think that he wouldn't exceed anything past strong. Like, this ice stuff is satisfying, it looks nice, but it also really hinders your character's movement abilities. So that's quite unfortunate, especially since he doesn't have Unstoppable. Now, granted, it's not going to be that big of a deal on, say, this boss, where everything's static in the terms of movement. But you look at something like Mortarion, where you're constantly having to move, and would you really want a whole bunch of ice on the battlefield that doesn't impact the boss, but impacts you, right? And I think ultimately the answer for me is going to be no. But with that being said, ladies and gentlemen, that is a look at Njal. We're talking about Jane Czar's passive ability, Tiark's passive ability, working on bosses. Now, granted, Legendary 4 Screamer Killer, he's going to hurt Jane Czar a little bit more than she can handle. But, you know, you look at different iterations of the boss and its different difficulty levels, maybe you can bring her. Tiark, I tested him in the past versus Mortarion, and the big thing that I want to talk about is his effectiveness there. His passive ability applies to the boss and reduces the actual psychic damage from his hit, but doesn't really affect the passive ability enough to really warrant being able to bring him and run a full melee team. So a little bit unfortunate there, and you'd just get absolutely shredded, and you'd have yourself a bad time, even if you do run Tiark Jane. And even if you were to do that, the damage numbers that you would get from running a melee team is just inconsequential. So ultimately, better to just keep running the traditional comps that you've been running in the past. So that is a look at Njal. That is a look at the debuffs versus non-debuffs that are debuffs versus blah, 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 blah. It's all a confusing mess. And the unfortunate Winged Prime nerf, or fortunate in terms of PvP, depending on how you want to look at it. So, with that being said, ladies and gentlemen, as always, let me know if there's anything else that you want to see, and until next time,